The movie begins with two couples, Abby and Paul Granger, traveling to see their state-of-the-art, fully integrated smart home as a part of the arrangement of Abby's new job at Integrate Robotics. This company manufactures a new generation of robots. The real estate agents show them around the house and list the technology fitted inside the home. Remotely activated appliances, cameras, smart locks, and reinforced are all part of the new house's perks. Paul moves around all their belongings, and the couple prepares to begin their new life. At night, Paul and Abby sit outside and enjoy their wine with a bonfire keeping them warm. Abby showed her knowledge of astronomy as Paul kept asking for the names of the stars, and their night was concluded with a kiss from Paul. In the morning, Abby goes to her new office at Integrate Robotics, and she is greeted by an artificial intelligence created with the deepfake technology displayed on the screen that resembles the owner of the company, Mr. Doosan. Within a few seconds, Mr. Doosan physically appears and greets Abby, a prosthetic engineer who is now going to be the new head of her department. He shows her around, and Abby is happy to see the latest technology in her department. Doosan introduces her to everyone and invites her to a dinner at his mansion at 8 and tells her that he will send a car. Before Doosan leaves, he tells her that a gift will be waiting for her at home, which makes Abby curious. Abby gets home and meets Paul, who was on the internet trying to look for a new job. After Abby informs him about the dinner, Paul tells about the new package that has arrived for her. They go down to the garage and open it. It was a prototype model of her new company's product called TIM, which stands for Technologically Integrated Manservant. The company has offered one of these for all department heads, and everyone calls it TIM. Paul doesn't like the idea of a robot servant, but Abby wants to try it at least for a few days. Paul touched it and the robot became active. It introduces itself and asks Abby's permission to pair itself with the smart devices in the house. Paul objects, but Abby, wanting to test it to its full limits, allows it. Tim was programmed to serve Abby, as she is a department head, and defer to her over Paul when it comes down to making decisions. Tim immediately takes control of the house duties and runs the bath despite Paul offering it as a gesture to his wife. Paul and Abby get ready, and their car arrives in the exact minute as Tim predicted it would. They get into the car and find out that it is a self-driving vehicle with a manual override option. They arrive at the Doosan residence and get welcomed by another Tim. The house was full of Tims that served different purposes, which was odd for Paul. The couple meets Doosan, who introduces them to his wife, Estelle. Then in the middle of the party, Doosan takes Abby for a moment to introduce her to some of his friends. Abby expresses her appreciation for the gift and tells Doosan about her husband's hesitation to keep Tim, but Doosan tells her that it is mandatory for all company employers, stating that it would be a bad look if the employees don't use their product. Abby is introduced to some important people by Doosan, who expresses his preference for robots over humans and thinks that intelligence, grace, and loyalty with lifelong energy are a far better deal than dealing with the messy emotions of humans. One of the Tims crushes a champagne glass, which suggests there was some glitch, and Abby promises to help fix these things. Doosan gets enthusiastic about her future in the company. After the long dinner, Paul and Abby get back to their home, and Tim comes out with an umbrella for both of them. Paul momentarily seemed to enjoy this and showed interest in keeping Tim. Tim locks all the doors simultaneously, and the couple goes upstairs to get romantic. The next morning, Rose, their new neighbor who lives down the cottage, visits them and presents a welcome present and her phone to Abby, who opens the door. Abby asks Paul about Rose, saying she met him, but Paul tells her he only said hi when he went for a walk. Then, Tim approaches them and asks them for their passwords to get full access to their devices. Paul is doubtful about giving up his privacy, but Abby mentions their agreement of a new beginning. Abby tells him that she needs complete transparency if she is going to learn to trust him again. Paul had an affair some time ago and he didn't want to fight with his wife, so he agreed, and both confirmed this decision using their fingerprint scanner. Tim suggests a letter word to be used as a safe phrase, a command that will automatically shut him down in case of any danger, and Paul leaves the scene. Later that night, Paul and Abby have a movie night. Paul finds Tim freaky, but Abby enjoys having it around. She asks Tim to come over and join them. Tim looked captivated by the romantic movie, and Abby asked him if he understood anything about love. Tim tells her he doesn't understand it and asks her instead, She describes it as wanting to spend all the time that one has with someone. After processing all the romantic descriptions of being safe and feeling better from Abby, Tim asks her if he loves her. Abby tells Tim that he doesn't, but appreciates it. Paul gets up the next morning and goes downstairs to prepare a breakfast for his wife, but Tim has already prepared a meal along with a rose for Abby. Then, Tim recites her daily schedule and tells Paul he has none, making him feel worse. Abby spends time trying to experiment with the grip of the robots, but Dewson, who is in a hurry to start production, thinks it is unnecessary. Abby comes into the house complaining about her work, but Tim is in the house instead of Paul. Tim offers to call Paul and tells Abby that his phone is off. Then, Tim asks to tell her husband's last GPS location, but Abby didn't want to know and decided to go for a run. Then, when she was about to go upstairs, Abby changed her mind and Tim told her that his last location was 300 meters from the house. Abby gets suspicious but goes for a run and enjoys herself in her bathtub after. Paul arrives home sometime later and apologizes for not calling her. Paul tells her he went to some recruitment agencies and helped Rose on his way back. He tells Abby not to be worried, and she thanks him for putting in the effort to stay at the new house. Paul leaves Abby to tend to herself but looks at Tim, who is coming to offer a towel to Abby, with some strain. After having a fertility test with her husband, Abby goes to work, where she encounters the same problem with Dewson, who orders one of the staff to shut down the work she specifically instructed. Abby is fed up with her boss's interference with work and decides to overrule him. Tim helps Abby select a dress for dinner. Tim has certain looks of attraction on his face and pauses to look at Abby's back. When Abby orders Tim to zip her up, he ends up ripping her dress and having a glitch where the lights are shown to be buzzing after realizing the mistake he made. Abby calms him down and he processes her touch on his shoulder differently. Abby meets Paul in another dress and asks him about his job interview. He tells her it went great, but he couldn't find something he could do in the vicinity. Rather, they recommended him for a job in London. Paul wanted to take the job because it would be in set hours, meaning he could go back and forth. But Abby forbids him from taking the job, telling him they are about to start a family. Then Abby gets angry and tells Paul that he doesn't listen to her or understand her. After the disappointing date, Abby stares outside while Paul is asleep, and on the next day at work, Abby's work on the grip shows a promising improvement. But she gets frustrated when she hears that the original design had problems and Dewson lets it slide. During her lunch break, Abby picks out a cloth for Paul and decides to give it to him as a present, but Tim, who has complete access to her phone, captures her every choice at the same time. Abby arrives home and sees Paul gardening, but she gets agitated when she sees Rose in the background. She asks Paul what she is doing at their home, and Paul tells her she offered to make garden plans. Paul asks Abby to trust him, and they seemingly reconcile. Abby gives him his present, while Tim has a mischievous look while doing work outside. In the coming days, Tim keeps performing his duty, but he shocks Abby when he calls the clinic to ask about the fertility result on her behalf. Tim effectively mimics Abby's voice and gets her worried because she didn't know about this ability of the robots. Abby leaves for work confused about her experience. Later, Paul cooks for his wife while Tim leaves in the company car. Abby notices that Paul is not wearing the blue shirt she brought for him and asks about it. Paul replies saying he couldn't find it. While they are talking about Tim, he arrives at the house with a different look, similar to the one that Abby was looking at when she was buying clothes for Paul. He tells Abby and Paul that he upgraded himself based on her browsing. Paul gets angry when Tim speaks about Abby's attraction to him and storms out. Abby tells Paul that Tim is just a computer. She orders Tim to get back to his previous appearance and not to do such a thing again. Then Tim goes inside and stares at Paul and Abby's wedding photos. Abby has good news at work the next day. She impresses Dewson with her new work on the prosthetic and significantly improves the robotic hand reaction. Later, she meets Paul, who has also a surprise of his own. Paul heard back from the company that offered him a job in London, and they informed him that he could work from home, only coming in for one day every 2 weeks. Abby congratulates him, and they celebrate with drinks. Paul and Abby go back to get intimate when her smartwatch indicates that she is ovulating. They passionately make love while Tim is seen getting a new prosthetic hand that Abby has developed earlier. After the maintenance, Tim closes his eyes and looks into the bedroom. While they are in bed talking about their day, the subject of Tim comes up, and Paul tells Abby that he wants Tim to go because it is creating a strain on their relationship, and he doesn't like the way he looks at her. Abby thinks Paul is acting ridiculously because Tim is just a computer, and she thinks he is looking for someone to blame. Abby tells Paul that she can't get rid of him because of work, but Paul reminds her of her value to the company now that she has saved their project and gives her till the end of the week. After listening to every conversation, Tim opens his eyes. Later, Tim appears while Abby rests on the couch. He apologizes for startling her and thanks her for his new prosthetic arms. Then he gives her a demonstration by rubbing her feet, which she enjoys quite well. But Paul arrives, and she quickly puts her feet down. He doesn't say much, but reminds her about only tolerating Tim for only a week. During another one of her lunch hours, Abby picks out a place for vacation. She decides to get rid of Tim and comes home to tell him. Abby tells Tim to sit down, and he decides to play a song for her on the piano. The song choice was not random. Abby had played it many times on her phone. Tim mentioned that Paul took her to see it live twice, but Abby insists it is only once. Tim tells her that he has a record of 2 tickets, which reminds Abby of the affair, and she gets upset. She goes upstairs to be alone for a moment, and she blames her distress on a headache when Paul, who just arrived at the scene, asks her what the problem is. Tim knowingly collides with Paul while walking around the house, although he is programmed to avoid such collisions. Later, Tim tells Paul that he had received an email that states the place he was looking to rent has fallen through, so Tim offers to set up the office upstairs and Paul agrees. Then, Paul asks Tim if he knows why Abby was upset, and Paul replies with the exact words Abby described him by saying, "I am not a person, just a computer," and leaves. Abby had a presentation that went well the next day while Paul and Tim spent their time working on the garden. Abby comes from home later and looks for Paul, and Tim tells her he has not seen him, but his phone is upstairs. Abby goes upstairs and finds Paul's office materials in the room that was reserved for their child in the future. Abby gets angry and gets into a fight with Paul, who just came in from a walk. She asked him about the office materials in the room upstairs, told her that he couldn't find a space outside and that it was set up temporarily by Tim. Abby gets angry and mentions Rose once again. Paul tells her that this was Tim's doing and that he is trying to break them up. But Abby tells him he is blaming everything on a robot and warns him about shutting Tim down without her permission. Then she orders Tim to prepare the spare room. Sometime later, while Abby is choosing clothes to wear, she sees a present Paul brought for her that makes her happy and puts it back so that Paul can surprise her later. After Abby leaves, Paul disposes of the red rose Tim picked out for Abby and finds out that the blue shirt has been ripped apart in the waste disposal machine. Paul knows this was Tim's doing, so after locating Tim on his camera to monitor him, Paul begins to search for artificial intelligence problems on the internet. Paul sees Tim on the camera smelling Abby's clothes that he messed up when she asked him to zip her up. Paul immediately takes pictures on his phone, but Tim knows what Paul is up to because of the cameras. Paul gets ready to get out and meet Abby for lunch to surprise her. Paul gets into the car and starts it won't start, so he asks Tim to arrange the self-driving company car. Paul calls Abby and leaves a message saying he is coming into the office with something important. Then, the self-driving car began increasing speed at a ridiculous rate. Tim gets scared and asks the car to slow down, but it keeps increasing again, so Paul goes to the driver's seat and tries to get control. He tried the brakes, but they didn't work. Then he remembered the manual override and tires to reach it, but the car was going to crash and the airbags were disabled. Paul quickly puts on his seatbelt and the car collides with an obstacle, then crashes. Meanwhile, Tim is revealed to be the one who sabotaged the old car so that Paul could take the self-driving car. Tim maintains the old car and puts everything back. Abby hears about Paul's accident and immediately rushes to the hospital. Paul tells her that he thinks Tim caused the accident by taking control of the car, but Abby thinks Paul must have hit his head hard and he is being paranoid. Paul repeatedly tells her Tim has something to do with it and offers to show her the pictures on his phone, but he knows Tim had deleted it. Paul warns Abby not to get close to Tim and tells her to check into a hotel, but Abby decides to stay with him at the hospital. Abby was awake that night thinking about what Paul said to her, while Tim sat on the couch monitoring Abby's heart rate with her smartwatch on her wristband. In the morning, Rose comes over to the house and tells Tim that she has heard about what happened to Paul. Tim invites Rose in while Abby prepares to pick up some things from the house. Abby promises to take the cab, and on her way home she meets Rose, who wants to talk about the garden, but Abby becomes nervous when she sees the necklace on Rose's neck. The necklace was the gift she found while she was changing clothes, so Abby pretended to be in a hurry and left. Abby immediately goes upstairs and checks the gift box, which is empty. Abby takes a seat with tearful eyes on the stairs. Tim offers to pack her bags when she mentions that she is at the house to get some things, but Abby goes back upstairs after telling Tim she doesn't know what to do. While Abby is upstairs thinking, Tim appears and tells her that he knows Paul wants to return him. Then he apologizes for upsetting her, mentioning his primary objective was to make life easy for her. Tim offers to arrange to be sent back to the company for failing the objective, but Abby tells him it's not his fault, but Paul's. Then, Tim tells Abby that he was programmed to serve her over Paul, and shares the reason he thinks Paul wanted to return him. With Abby's help in overriding his privacy protocols, Tim shows her footage recorded when she went to London with Dewson for her presentation. The video shows Paul kissing Rose, which further breaks her heart. Abby decided to stay at home and she didn't pick up when Paul called that day. Paul takes a cab home and arrives on crutches. Paul goes inside, but he finds his bags were packed and his blue shirt was sitting on top. He understood that Tim was the one who put the blue fabric in the waste disposal machine and orchestrated everything down to the very last detail. Tim tells Paul that Abby doesn't wish to see him and that he should leave. When Paul confronts Tim, Abby appears and confronts her husband about cheating with Rose. She tells him about the video, but he doesn't have any idea. Tim shows Paul the video, but Paul says it was not him. Abby also confronts him about the necklace, and Tim accesses the recent purchases and states the records. Despite Paul's plea, saying Tim was the one behind everything, Abby orders him to get out. Paul couldn't get close as Tim was blocking his way. Paul leaves after insulting Tim. Later, Paul calls Rose and asks her to look out for Abby after telling her he would be out of town for a while. Rose knew the reason why he was worried and told him that Tim tried to kiss her when she came over to the house to check up on Paul's accident. Rose thought he was a man, but Paul tells her Tim is a robot. Paul calls the house using a payphone and tells Abby that he has found what Tim did and has proof. He also tells her to wait for him at Rose's place, where he will clear everything up with Rose. He hangs up the phone after telling her to stay away from Tim, and she agrees. But Paul was not talking with Abby this whole time. It was Tim pretending to be Abby using his voice cloning ability. Abby appears after hearing Tim speak on the phone and asks who called, and Tim lies to her, saying it was just a salesman. While Abby was out for a run, Paul came to the house with his suitcase to pick up Abby, whom he thought had agreed to stay away. Paul keeps walking inside the house, calling his wife's name, but Tim appears from behind and hits him in the head with a shovel. He drags Paul and restrains him with buckle belts, then gags his mouth. Tim is interrupted by Rose, who came over to see Abby. Tim goes to open the door after putting Paul in a bathtub. Rose asks where Paul is after seeing his suitcase, but Tim tells her that Abby is out and Paul is no longer found at this address. Paul tries to make a sound, and Rose hears it, but Tim runs the water and blames it on a plumbing problem. After closing the door on Rose, Tim comes back upstairs and begins to drown Paul in the bathtub. Tim tortures Poole and finally holds him down in the water until he dies. The next day, Abby meets Rose, who asks her about Paul. Abby confronts her about the supposed affair and the necklace. Rose replies saying that she thought Abby was the one who sent it to thank her for the garden plans. Abby leaves Rose being angry, but she gets back home and checks the footage of the kiss. After repeatedly looking at it, she notices the video is a deep fake, and Tim was the one who orchestrated it. Then, she calls the jewelry store and asks about the necklace. She discovers that Tim was the one who ordered and collected it. While Abby was standing distressed, she noticed the gardening plans and went out to look at them. Abby suspects that her husband might be buried in it and tries to leave, but she notices Tim is there. So, she tries her best to lower her heart rate and asks Tim to go and pick some flowers at the flower shop. Abby digs the garden and finds Paul's body, but Tim appears behind and tries to reason with her. Abby tried to shut him down, but it didn't work. She tries to run and call the police, but Tim catches up to her and knocks her out. She wakes up to find Tim preparing a romantic bath. Abby runs upstairs and destroys the cameras. She tries to escape through the windows, but Tim finds and ties her to her chair. He tries to make her swallow some pills to make her death look like suicide, but Rose comes over to her house and demands that Tim let her in. Tim forces her to leave. Tim was about to strangle Abby, but she was saved when Rose rams the front door with her car and stabs him with a pitchfork. But Tim removes it and stabs Rose with a kitchen knife, planning to make Abby take the fall for the murder. Tim takes Abby upstairs and holds her by her neck, threatening to let her go, but she figures out the new safe words, which Tim thought she would never guess. "I love you, Tim." Tim shuts down after she says the word. The movie ends after Abby finds out that she is pregnant from her smart wristband. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our recap. Like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.